My name is Lena Matthews. I'm 32 years old, and I was once thrown out of my father's house in the middle of the night just because I was pregnant. He yelled, "What have you done?" and slammed the door in my face like I was some filthy stain he couldn't scrub clean. He didn't know the truth. No one in my family did. All they knew was how to judge. 15 years later, they stood at my doorstep, but it wasn't the child that left them speechless, pale, and frozen in place. It was my life. Everything I had quietly rebuilt from the ground up with nothing but empty hands the night I was cast out. If you've ever been rejected simply for living differently, stay with me. This story is for you. I was born and raised in a small southern town in Indiana where every road seemed to lead to church, and every dinner began with a prayer. My father, Reverend Jonathan Matthews, was a well-known pastor, admired for his solemn presence, booming voice, and moral-laced sermons. He didn't just preach on Sunday mornings, he also taught ethics at the local high school where I sat quietly in the back, avoiding his gaze whenever he warned of the downfall of modern women. My mother, Ruth, was the very image of a God-fearing wife. She never argued, never dared to disagree, or "your father doesn't want that." To her, my father was the sole moral compass our family was meant to follow, and I, as the only child, had no right to stray. From a young age, I knew I was different. I never enjoyed those endless prayer circles, never understood why we had to suppress every emotion just to set an example. I loved drawing. I remember the first time I showed my mother a portrait I'd drawn of her smiling while washing dishes in our warm kitchen. She said nothing. She quietly tore the paper in half, tossed it in the trash, and told me, "You should be praying, not doodling nonsense." The older I got, the more suffocated I felt by what they called family values. I wasn't allowed to wear tight jeans because it was immodest. I couldn't stay late after school because who knows what you're doing with those boys. When I earned top marks in art class and got nominated for a summer creative camp, my father's only reaction was a cold, "Summer camp? Living with morally lost kids? Absolutely not." My dream of leaving Indiana for a world full of color and music felt further away than ever. My father always claimed he raised me with love, but that love felt like a cage gilded with Bible verses, polished with performative pride when he'd say at church, "My daughter isn't like those other misguided kids," but inside that cage, I couldn't breathe. I still remember being 15, accidentally overhearing my parents talking behind closed doors. My mother's voice trembled as she said, "I think she should be allowed to take art lessons. She really has talent." My father's reply was ice cold. "She doesn't need useless artist skills. She needs to learn how to be a proper wife." After that night, I started hiding my sketchbooks in the closet. Every night, I'd draw by flashlight, using old calendar cardboard as makeshift paper. Not because I hoped for approval, but because I needed somewhere to pour out everything I couldn't say out loud. The worst part was whenever relatives came to visit, I was always used as an example of what it meant to be a pastor's daughter who acted like she belonged to some godless family down the street. My aunt would scan me from head to toe, sneering, "You're really wearing that ridiculous dress to church again." I would only lower my head. I learned to stay quiet. I learned not to cry. My father confiscated my phone for 2 entire months just because he saw I had been texting a boy from school. A pastor's daughter doesn't dabble in teenage romance. You're supposed to set an example. I wiped away my tears in silence and kept studying, but those wounds, even unspoken, etched themselves deeper into my memory than any sermon my father ever preached. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing of all was that no one had ever once asked me, "Are you happy?" In that house, happiness wasn't something to be acknowledged. The only thing that mattered was obedience. I knew I had to leave if I didn't want to lose myself entirely. In my final year of high school, I secretly applied to an art school in Chicago. Something my father would have labeled as blasphemous and rebellious if he had ever found out. I used money I had saved from secretly working at a tiny bookshop in town. That money, though small, was proof of every moment I chose to live as myself instead of pretending to be the perfect daughter in his eyes. When the acceptance letter arrived, I couldn't even bring myself to open it right away. sit on my lap in the stillness of the night, in a bedroom I had lived in for 18 years but never dared to call home. When I finally opened it, the word congratulations burst into my chest like fireworks. I covered my mouth and cried, not because I was happy, but because, for the first time, a door had opened that I didn't need anyone's permission to walk through. I left home that fall, telling my parents I'd enrolled in a short religious art program. I boarded the bus alone, carrying nothing but an old suitcase and a paper map marked with red circles around every place I dreamed of seeing. Chicago was loud, crowded, and completely unfamiliar, but it was there that I met Eli. Eli was a photography student from the Netherlands, studying abroad at my school. We met by accident, sitting at the same table during a workshop on color and emotion. I sketched him as a joke. He snapped a photo of me frowning while adjusting my brush. Somehow, we kept bumping into each other after class, and then after dinners, and slowly, after long conversations about art, freedom, and things I had never dared to say out loud. With Eli, I didn't have to defend myself. He never asked why I didn't believe in forgiveness. He just said, if you're not ready to forgive, then paint your anger first. We fell in love like two misfit kids who'd found each other in a strange city, holding hands while running through snowy streets, sharing our last few coins to buy a jam-filled pastry. And then, one day, I found out I was pregnant. I sat frozen in my tiny apartment for over 2 hours, clutching the test stick with its 2 red lines, each one slicing through my thoughts like a blade. I wasn't afraid of becoming a mother. I was afraid of being abandoned. Afraid of my father's glare, my mother's whispers, the judgment of the town I once called home. He didn't ask, "What are you going to do?" He simply asked, "Are you okay?" He said he would stay, that he'd find a way for us to be together, that he would do anything so the 3 of us could build a life together. But life doesn't follow ideals. Eli's mother had a serious accident back home. His family demanded he return immediately, no delay, no exception. Within a week, he was on a parade. Before he left, he held me tighter than ever, placed his hand gently over my stomach, and said, "I'll come back, no matter what happens. I'll always be with you." I wanted to believe him, did believe him, and then I went back to Indiana. Not to apologize, not to seek forgiveness. I simply needed a place to rest for a few days, to collect my thoughts and figure out what to do next. I imagined 100 different outcomes, my mother crying and holding me, my father staying silent but eventually opening the guest room door, or at least a quiet dinner where silence might mean things will be okay. But no. When I stood on the front porch, my belly visibly rounded beneath my thin coat, my father didn't speak for several seconds. Then he stepped forward and looked at me like I was a stranger. "What have you done?" he growled, each word laced with venom. I hadn't even had time to breathe, to speak, when he spun around, opened the door, glanced at my mother standing just inside, her eyes red but dry, as if even tears weren't allowed, and then turned back to scream in my face. "Get out, and don't you ever come back." The door slammed. The night wind cut through me like a knife as I stood frozen on the porch, one hand over my belly, the other gripping the handle of my worn-out suitcase. No one said a word. No one called after me. No one watched me walk away. They didn't know that inside me was the flesh and blood of the only grandson they would ever have. They didn't know they had just cast away a piece of their own future. I turned away without tears, without screaming, without begging. Just a tight-lipped smile and a single whispered thought looping in my head. I won't come back. Not because I don't need my parents, but because they chose to let me go first. That night, I wandered down leaf-covered streets leading out of a town that, from that moment on, I no longer dared to call home. There was no train station, no open motel. In my pocket were a few crumpled bills, a nearly dead phone, and a body growing heavier each day with the tiny life inside me. I found a bus stop 3 blocks away, crawled into the little plastic shelter, pulled out the torn sleeping bag from my suitcase, and curled up beneath the dim yellow light. My belly was already past 5 months along. Every movement sent sharp pain through my back. I was still alive. I thought about Eli. I didn't blame him. I knew deep down that if he could, he would have stayed. But the truth was, I was alone now. And the child inside me, my child, would have to learn how to grow up in a world that wouldn't go easy on either of us. The next morning, I made a call to the only person left in Eli's orbit, an old classmate of his I'd met just once at a school party. Margot Klein. I didn't expect anything, but her number was still saved in my phone under the name Margot Hair Like Fire. When her voice came through the receiver, raspy, slow, but kind, I broke down, sobbing like a child. Less than 2 hours later, Margot pulled up to the bus stop with a thick coat, a bottle of warm water, and the first hug I'd received in what felt like an eternity. "He told me about you," she said gently as I sat curled in her car, clutching the water bottle like a lifeline. Their foolish boy thought that if he didn't hurt you, silence would somehow be the kindest option. But silence can kill, too. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, tears running down my cheeks without pause. Margot brought me home to her small wooden house on the outskirts of California, filled with paintings, old books, and warm golden light. She told me I could stay as long as I needed. "This is a home for artists, and you, my dear, are an artist, aren't you?" The months that followed were slow but steady steps toward healing. Margot taught me how to mix color, how to manage a classroom, how to apply for grants from local arts programs. I taught neighborhood kids how to paint their feelings, how to speak through color when words were too hard. And quietly, I prepared for the birth of the child I had come to call the light in my darkness. The day Isaac was born, the rain came down in torrents. Margot drove me to the local hospital, holding my hand through hours of unbearable pain. When the doctor finally lifted my baby from my body and placed him on my chest, the emptiness inside me vanished. My limbs felt like soft clay, but my heart, I named him Isaac Eli Matthews. Isaac, which means God's laughter in Hebrew. Eli, to remember his father, even though I didn't know if he would ever return. Matthews, the surname I carried, even though those who gave it to me wanted nothing to do with the grandson born under it. After we were discharged, I moved in with Margot for good, helping her run a small community art center for children who had been abandoned or raised by single parents. I taught art, studied art therapy, and began writing a blog to share my story. Not to seek pity, but to remind people like me that pain doesn't need to be erased to be accepted. It can be kept, painted, and turned into something uniquely beautiful. Meanwhile, I heard from old acquaintances that my parents were still lying about me, that I had run off to live sinfully, that they had run off to save me but failed. Their version of the story spread through the church like a moral warning. No one knew the truth, and no one asked, but it didn't matter anymore, because every day when I saw Isaac smile, scribble with crayons, call me mommy in his sweet sing-song voice, I knew I hadn't lost everything. I had only lost what was never worth keeping. My family was no longer the place I was born. My family now was the one I chose, the place where I was loved for who I was, without kneeling to any mold. I thought that after surviving the worst, being cast out while pregnant, giving birth with no home to return to, I would become stronger. But pain doesn't arrive once and then leave. It lingers, seeps into every crack of your soul, burns quietly like an old scar only you can feel. There were nights when, after Isaac had fallen asleep, I'd sit alone by the window, staring at the street lamp's faint glow and wondering, do my parents ever regret it? No texts, no calls. Not once had they reached out, and even though I had been the one to cut all ties, deleting phone numbers, blocking them on Facebook, changing my email, there was still a small, fragile part of me that hoped someone might break through it all just to say, "Are you okay?" I wasn't okay. Some mornings, I couldn't even get out of bed. Everything felt too heavy. Even bright, sunny days seemed to pierce my eyes, reminding me of mornings when Mom made breakfast and Dad laid his hand on my shoulder to bless me before school. Though those memories had faded, they still stung whenever Isaac asked, "Mommy, do Grandma and Grandpa still exist?" I never knew how to answer. I was afraid that if I told the truth, my son would grow up angry. But if I lied, would I be rebuilding the illusion I had sacrificed my youth to escape? In the end, I just said, "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe one day we'll find out." There was a time when Margot went away on a 2-week work trip, and I had to manage everything on my own. The classes, the childcare, the bookkeeping, the meals. Tasks I had grown used to, but when no one was around, they suddenly felt unbearably heavy. During the first session, I couldn't say anything except one sentence: "I hate being a mother alone." I felt guilty the moment those words left my mouth, as if I had betrayed Isaac. But the therapist simply smiled and said, "You're not alone because you're weak. You're alone because you were abandoned." That sentence pulled a thorn straight from my chest. I broke down crying harder than I had since the night I was thrown out of my parents' house. Was I really deserving of rejection just because I got pregnant? Was I wrong for keeping the baby instead of giving him up in exchange for forgiveness? Those questions echoed like a background soundtrack in my mind. Every painting I finished, every class I led, was my way of reminding myself, I'm still here, I'm still going. But that journey didn't always feel peaceful. I remember one night, Isaac came down with a high fever. I carried him through the pouring rain to the nearest hospital. Sitting in the emergency room, watching the harsh white light fall over his pale face, I silently wished my parents were there. Not because I needed them to take care of him, but because I wanted someone to see me, to see how hard I was trying, and to say, how hard I was trying, and to say, you didn't come, there was no miracle. Just me and my son, like always. Isaac recovered, but I didn't. I began withdrawing from everything. No more blog posts, no more community events. I existed, but I no longer felt alive. I became a quiet shadow of myself, working, going home, sleeping, repeating. One day, while rearranging the bookshelf, I found an old letter one from my mother, sent about a year after Isaac was born. I had never opened it. The envelope was yellowed, the handwriting careful, and there was no return address. I hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet, with only a few lines. "Lena, I don't know where you are, but every night I dream of the little girl. I'm sorry I did nothing when your father kicked you out. I was scared, but I miss you every day." I folded the letter back up, not crying, not angry, just empty. A single apology cast into the desert, heard by no one, answered by no one. But it was also the first sign that maybe one day the silence might finally crack. From that day on, I began writing in my journal again, not to complain, but to understand myself. I wrote about the night I was cast out, about the fear in the hospital, about each one of Isaac's little smiles, and gradually, something unfamiliar started forming inside me. Not quite hope, but something like the first flicker of light after a long stretch of darkness. I still hadn't forgiven, but at the very least I had begun stepping out of the cocoon of my pain. I can't point to one exact moment when everything changed, because it didn't come with thunder or drama. It began with the smallest things, a morning when Isaac grinned proudly after tying his shoelaces by himself. A day when Margot returned from an art exhibition and placed a flyer on my desk that read, "We need you, an artist who heals with color." And one quiet evening, as I was sorting paintings in the center storage room, Margot placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You need to lift your head, not so others can see you, but so you can see yourself." I decided to apply for a position as a creative coordinator with an international organization supporting children with emotional trauma. The project was called Colors of the Brave, a name that felt like it had been waiting for me. I submitted the application without much hope, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd see something in me, something beyond a fractured past. But 2 weeks later, they called. I had been chosen, not as an assistant, not as a volunteer, but as the regional art ambassador for the West Coast. On my first day at headquarters, I wore the coat Margot had made for me, its collar embroidered with Isaac's name like a quiet blessing. During the meeting, I shared about my first class, the one where a little girl, abused by her father, drew her fear as a school of fish with tearful eyes. The room went silent, then erupted in applause. I no longer felt small. I no longer needed forgiveness to know I had value. Around that same time, I received a strange message in my new email inbox. The name was familiar. Eli Van Houten. My heart pounded as my fingers trembled over the subject line, Isaac. In the letter, Eli apologized for the years of silence. He explained that all traces of me had vanished. His family had intervened, deleted contacts, hidden correspondence, afraid of the shame. Only recently, after his mother passed away, had he found the letters I'd written, still unopened, in an old drawer. He wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to know if you and our son are okay. And if possible to see you both, even just once." It took me nearly 3 days to respond. I didn't accuse or blame him. I simply wrote, "Our son's name is Isaac Eli Matthews. He loves to draw, hates broccoli, and has eyes that look so much like yours. He is not lacking in love. But maybe he deserves to know where he comes from." And we met at a small cafe by the beach, the same beach where Isaac often ran wild on weekends. When Eli walked in, his hair was trimmed short, his chin shadowed by stubble, but his eyes, they were still the same eyes that once made me feel seen. Isaac sat quietly for a long moment, studying the stranger, then tilted his head and asked, "Do you like orange?" Eli smiled, "Very much. It's like sunset." That meeting didn't erase the wounds, but it opened a door. Not to return to the past, but to continue writing the present. Eli didn't beg. He didn't ask Isaac to call him dad. He simply asked to be present as a friend, as a trustworthy adult. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to carry everything alone. Meanwhile, the Forgive/Forget initiative that Margot and I launched began to grow. We hosted exhibitions in 7 states, led free workshops for women rejected by their families, and built a support network through healing art. My posts about single motherhood, rejection, and rebirth were shared thousands of times. But I wasn't chasing fame. I only hoped that if someone out there was trembling the way I once did, standing before a slamming door, they'd know there was still a way forward. Isaac is now 10 years old. He paints better than I did at 15 and has an extraordinary memory for colors. One afternoon, after an exhibit in Santa Barbara, he pulled me aside in the crowd and said, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to open an art center like you, but I won't let anyone have to draw in fear." I held him tight, saying nothing, because no words could ever match the purity of that love. I began to believe that forgiveness isn't about making others feel better. Forgiveness is what lets you keep walking without dragging someone else's weight behind you. I don't know if my parents will ever call, or knock, or even send another letter. But I know that if they ever do, I'll be strong enough to listen, and calm enough to draw a boundary. I was teaching Isaac how to dilute watercolor to paint the sky when the doorbell rang. The sound felt foreign, not because it startled me, but because I wasn't expecting anyone. Jonathan jumped off his chair, hands still smudged with blue paint, but I stopped him. "Let me see who it is." When I opened the door, I froze. Standing there was my father, Jonathan Matthews, his hair nearly all gray, his frame thinner, and his eyes no longer sharp with judgment. Beside him was my mother, Ruth, her face weary, holding a small bag in one hand. They looked as if they had crossed a desert just to get here. And maybe, for them, that's exactly what it had felt like, a journey across states to reach the daughter they had once cast out without hesitation. We stared at each other for what felt like a lifetime. No one said a word. Then my mother stepped back, as if she couldn't bear to stand too close. My father was the one to speak first. "Lena." His voice was coarse, empty of condemnation, but also of warmth. Just a name spoken like he was trying to thread it back into the present with a trembling hand. I didn't invite them in. But Isaac, ever curious, ran to my side. I knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gently said, "They're your grandparents." My mother broke into tears the moment she heard the word. My father just stood there, something visibly cracking inside him. Reluctantly, I opened the door wider. They stepped into our home, their eyes scanning the paintings on the walls, works by me, my students, and Isaac. But I knew exactly where their gaze would stop. The large painting by the living room entrance. It was a portrait I had painted entirely from memory, the night I was cast out. Me, standing on the porch in the dark, arms around my pregnant belly, eyes brimming with tears. Behind me, the wooden door, freshly slammed with the faint shadow of my father framed in a sliver of gold light. I painted it on a sleepless night, to remind myself that moment happened. It wasn't a nightmare. My father stood before that painting for a long time. He said nothing. I poured water, sat down at the table. Isaac climbed into a chair, chatting away about the dragon he just drew with a rainbow tail and how he was really good with colors. My mother listened with tears in her eyes, but didn't dare step closer. There was a distance between them, one that couldn't be bridged by small talk. "I saw you on television," my father finally said. He paused, as though every word had to pass through a conscience not yet fully awakened. "I didn't realize it was really you." "Really me who didn't fall?" I asked, my voice steady. "Who didn't starve, didn't abort, didn't become the disgrace you once preached about?" My mother flinched, gently tugging his sleeve, but my father didn't react. He simply lowered his head and softly muttered. I felt the whole world inside me go still for a moment, not because I had longed to hear those words, but because I had once believed he would never say them. "I didn't come here to apologize," he continued. "I came because I want to know if I can still be a part of your life, even just a very small part." I said nothing. Isaac ran to the corner of the room, pulled out a drawing of a 3-person family, and asked, "Mommy, can I add Grandma and Grandpa to this?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I stood up, walked over to my parents, and looked at them closely, 2 people who had once been my entire world, who had then made me a stranger over a truth they were too afraid to try and understand. I spoke slowly. "My son has the right to know who his grandparents are, but he also has the right to know the truth. If you're ready to speak it from the beginning, with no edits, no distortions, no pretending, then I won't stop you." My father nodded, my mother cried, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the one on the losing side. I wasn't expecting one conversation to fix everything, but I gave them a chance, for Isaac's sake, and for mine. We sat down at the dining table where every meal in my house now overflowed with laughter and color. My mother glanced around at the embroidered tablecloth Isaac had stitched, the greeting card from the international conference where I'd been invited to speak, his rainbow drawings stuck proudly to the fridge, and she cried more than she spoke. My father began to recount that night. He didn't make excuses, at least not in the way I had braced for. Back then, I only thought about reputation, about what people would say, about the church's image. His voice broke. "I forgot that you weren't a threat to my reputation. You were my daughter." I looked at him, not angry, but not softened either. All I ever needed was a hug, a question, even a flicker of doubt that I wasn't trash. "The way you once looked at me." My voice was calm, but firm. "But you shut the door. And you didn't just throw me out of the house, you threw me out of this family's life." I was a coward, but every year that passed, I prayed for your safety. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small necklace, inside it a photo of me as a little girl. "I've always worn it. I've never stopped missing you." I placed my hand over hers, not gripping it, not pulling away. I just left it there, an acknowledgement that I had heard her. But I hadn't forgotten. Isaac returned, holding up his finished drawing, a house with 4 figures standing in front. A brown-haired child, a woman holding a paintbrush, an elderly man with a silver beard, and a white-haired grandmother, with cookies in her hand. He handed it to me, then turned to my parents and asked. They both nodded, eyes wet. But when they looked to me for a nod in return, I said clearly, "I can't call this home." But Isaac deserves to know his grandparents. My son isn't here to soothe your guilt. If you want to be in his life, you have to accept my boundaries. My father blinked. What boundaries? No more father knows best, no more using scripture to control, no more telling Isaac how he should live. I am his mother. I decide what's right for him. You're not here to reclaim your role as parents. You're here to start becoming people I can trust. I had practiced that line 100 times in my head. But nothing compared to the feeling of actually saying it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I was simply clear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't timid in my father's presence. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. I simply felt like myself, a woman, a mother, a person finally strong enough to set boundaries without shame. My mother nodded softly. My father stood, his gaze sweeping across the room one last time. This house, it's like you. Very real, very colorful, very alive. Thank you, I said, without smiling. I built it with my own hands using the same bricks you once threw at me. The air was heavy, but I knew there was still one thing I had to do, the one thing I owed to myself. Not the one my mother had written me, but one I had written after Isaac was born, never sent. I placed it on the table in front of them. I didn't write this to apologize. I wrote it so I'd never forget how I survived. My father opened the letter. Inside, I had written about the night I gave birth, about the loneliness, about the times Isaac had burning fevers and the only arms around him were mine, about the fear I carried that my son might inherit the same wounds. I've forgiven you, but forgiveness doesn't mean allowing things to repeat. From today on, I am no longer the girl who was thrown out into the night. I'm the one who decides who gets to step into my world and who must stay outside. My father lowered his head, silently crying. For the first time, the man who once made me tremble looked small in front of me. I placed my hand on his shoulder, just for a second, then pulled it away. I hope you both do better, not for me, but for Isaac. He deserves grandparents who love him for real, not through judgment, not through expectations, but through presence. They left shortly after, carrying Isaac's drawing and the letter that had never been sent. I stood on the porch, watching them fade into the golden light of evening. No tears, no anger, just a lightness kissed my hand and asked, "Mommy, did I draw Grandma and Grandpa well?" I smiled, ruffled his hair. "Beautifully, but do you know what's most beautiful?" "What?" he asked. "That you know how to love, without fear." 1 year after that meeting, our little house seemed to have changed colors. Not the paint on the walls, but the emotions in the air. Everything was still simple, still filled with drawings, children's books, the smell of wax crayons, and Isaac's laughter. But peace had crept into the details, the kind of peace that only comes after you've touched the deepest part of pain and decided it won't define what comes next. I continued leading the Forgive/Forget project, but this time I launched a new branch, just for children growing up with a quiet sense of being unwanted. They didn't need a place to paint, to scream in color, to know that their feelings didn't need to be hidden. I shared my story at a few conferences, in a few articles, in short videos. Not to become an inspirational figure, but to tell those who were like me, you are not invisible. And then, one spring afternoon, while I was editing a lesson plan, there was a knock at the door. It was my mother. She came alone, holding a wooden box, her face solemn. I opened the door, not surprised. She stepped in and looked around as if trying to memorize everything. The photo frames, the jars of colored pencils, the tablecloth Isaac had dyed by hand. She handed me the box. "It's your father's journal. After seeing you again, he started writing." Said nothing as I lifted the lid. Inside were worn pages, his familiar slanted handwriting, and hesitant sentences, as though every word had been carved from someone who no longer recognized himself. Today I saw Isaac, and I realized I've missed an entire lifetime. I don't know how to make it right. Some nights I pray, not to be forgiven, but that the girl can live in peace, never needing to remember me again. I closed the journal and felt a warm current pass gently through my chest. Not sadness, not quite forgiveness either, but release. I no longer needed him to change. But I knew he had fought his own darkness, and for a man like him, maybe that was the bravest thing he'd ever done. My mother asked if she could stay a few days. I didn't promise anything. But Isaac took her by the hand and pulled her into the garden to show off his newly planted sprouts. I watched their silhouettes, one generation that had once broken me and another that gave me strength to rise again, and I smiled without a trace of bitterness. A few months later, I curated a special exhibit called Rooted Twice, for those who grow new roots not because they were cut down, but because they chose to rise again. I displayed paintings from my journey as a single mother. The final piece was a pair of arms in an embrace, not perfect but warm enough to leave nothing else needing to be said. The opening night was crowded. Amid the faces, I saw Eli standing quietly in the back, holding a small bouquet. He didn't push forward, didn't interrupt. He waited until I approached, then softly said, "Isaac drew you reading by the window." He said, "That's Mommy when she's peaceful. You once told me all you needed was a quiet place with soft light to paint. Looks like you have it now." I nodded, saying nothing. Some stories don't need to end with a hug or a kiss. Sometimes a simple nod is enough to say, that night, sitting with Isaac by the window, he turned to me and asked, "Mommy, when I grow up, you'll never feel lonely again, right?" I laughed. Maybe happiness really is that simple. I don't know if my parents will return again. I don't know what path Eli and I will choose as a trio. But I know this with certainty. I'm no longer afraid of being left behind. Because I no longer let others decide my worth. I am Lena Matthews, the girl whose father once slammed a door in the dead of night over a secret he never had the courage to hear. The woman who raised her child through fear and grit. The artist who painted her life with the colors of pain, of freedom, of forgiveness, and of love that asked for nothing in return. If you've ever been pushed aside just because you didn't fit someone else's expectations, remember this: you are not wrong. You're simply walking a different path, and maybe that path is the only one where you're truly allowed to be yourself. And if you've ever survived a slammed door, don't hesitate to share your story in the comments below. Here, no one is invisible. Here, those who've been left behind will always find one another.